I'll be speaking in this talk about pre-registration and pre-analysis plans. So this is, one of, a set of different practices and approaches that you'll hear about this week. Certainly one that's been influential in the social sciences in recent years, but so a little bit less kind of big picture, although I'll still have some big picture in motivating these approaches, and then we'll start talking about a few of the specifics, but you'll hear about a lot more of the specifics in tomorrow's session as well as from Alex later on. So again, this is just the same slide as before, and here I'll be focusing on some of those top elements on the right: pre-registration and pre-analysis plans. The starting point here, and this kind of just sort of builds on some of the final, like one of the final questions on my slide before is, I asked, are there really problems in social science research? I think what we've learned through many studies over many over the last few decades is there really are issues in empirical social science research that relate to failures of open science. There's literatures where there appear to be a lot of false positives. There appear to be cases where results are not reported in a very balanced way. So there's tendentious, meaning biased reporting. There also appear to be lots of findings, especially null findings. So not significant findings or zero findings that just never get reported to the scientific community. And that's something that's been sort of known for many decades and remains a problem today. And then the question is, what do we do to solve these problems? What can we do? And really it was some of these sorts of concerns and some of the earlier studies cited here that motivated us to start BITSS in 2012. So as part of some of the early BITSS meetings, actually, a bunch of us who were involved in these early discussions wrote a paper that came out in 2014 that talked about a few different ways that we can start addressing these problems. So in that particular article published in 2014, we listed 3 specific approaches. One is disclosure, meaning authors, researchers should disclose aspects of their, sort of completely disclose aspects of their work, disclose their relationships, say, with funders, should disclose potential conflicts of interest, et cetera. And, importantly, really just disclose everything they did to get to where they did in the research. The second point that was emphasized was the importance of open data and materials. This has the kind of immediate benefit of allowing other scholars to replicate work. And as we talked about in the Mertonian norms, being able to check and verify and replicate others' work is really a central value in science. But one question that emerged in a lot of our early discussions was, well, even if we're asking folks to disclose the design they used, say, in their research, or disclose aspects of their data, and we're also asking them to share their data and their materials, how can we verify that what they're disclosing is actually correct or complete? So they may tell us that they've done A or B, but in fact they've done C. And that's really where pre-registration, it's one of the ways, it was one of the motivations for pre-registration. I'll talk about others. But to the extent that researchers pre-register or make public their research hypotheses in advance, it does have the benefit of allowing the rest of the scholarly community to understand what they intended at the start of a project. And so if in the pre-registration we know what their research questions were, or we know what the treatment arms were in a particular randomized controlled trial, then we can check later on when they disclose and say, look, we had these 3 treatment arms. Well, maybe the pre-registration said they had 5. So we can try to investigate that discrepancy. There's also advantages of pre-registration that we'll come back to. Even though open data and materials seem absolutely central to research transparency, right? Just being able to investigate the data for yourself, check that the analysis that was done is, can be reproduced, replication may itself may not be enough. And I think, for instance, in the, those who do, say, psychology labs or experimental economics labs, they're used to thinking of their lab as something that can be relatively easily replicated. So I ran a lab here, with 200 subjects. You can run the same sorts of protocols in your lab with 200 subjects, and we can see how much the results replicate. But for those who are not necessarily doing lab experiments, who are doing field experiments, or who are doing lab experiments in a very particular social or political context, you may not be able to replicate it. So for instance, with colleagues, I ran some economic experimental labs in Kenya in the run-up to an election, the 2013 election. So we were investigating issues specific to that election in the lab. There's no way anybody else can easily replicate it. It was like done in that context. So, we can't necessarily think that the ability to replicate is going to solve all of our problems. Pre-registration could still be important. So I'll come back to why I'm making that point later on, but just to point out that these three pillars that we emphasize, disclosure, open data, and pre-registration, all sort of reinforce each other. And it's part of this vision of reaching a new equilibrium in social science research. We may need multiple legs on the stool to support a new equilibrium. And one thing alone may only be partially effective. But if we adopt disclosure, open data, pre-registration, and some other changes, we may enter a new equilibrium. So let me just start with some background. What is pre-registration? What do I mean when I use that term? The idea is that researchers would post their research hypotheses, the data they would use, their research design and methodology in some registry that's publicly available, so other scholars can scrutinize it. Now, the way this has worked in practice is sometimes folks will post a registration, but it only becomes public after some point in time. There's what's called embargo period. And the reason there is to allow scholars to pursue ideas without maybe the rest of the scholarly community knowing exactly what they're doing before they've even generated results, if they're afraid that others would copy their approach. But all these registries have some sort of embargo period where after a certain amount of time, this becomes public. Okay, so that's one point I'll come back to below. When you think about this idea of pre-registration, immediately, you're going to wonder about how detailed should we be? How much detail should we go into? Should we give every last detail of our sample size, every last detail of our, every regression we're going to run, every bit of analysis, we're going to do? This is another area of debate that I'll come back to during the lecture today, but let me just kind of push it aside for now. So just imagine that there's sort of a standard set of fields. So let me get into the one particular registry that's been very influential, the American Economic Association registry. So important in my own field of economics, but there's other registries in other fields. In psychology, many people post pre-registration documents on the Open Science Framework, OSF, or on As Predicted. In political science, the EGAP registry, Experiments in Governance and Politics registry, is the go-to registry. Obviously, for medical research, there's clinicaltrials.gov and many other registries. So there's been this proliferation of registries, but in the social sciences, registries are a really new thing, really only dating to about 6 or 7 years ago. So let me talk about this registry that I know best in my own field, but there's some parallels with others. So the AA registry started about 7 years ago. It focuses on randomized controlled trials. This is just, yesterday or 2 days ago, I just went to the sort of opening page. This is their registry. It describes sort of the origin of it a little bit. It's free to register. You don't need to be a member of the American Economic Association. You'll see some reference there on that title page to pre-results review at the Journal of Development Economics. So Alex of BITSS is going to talk about that right after my talk today. And they say if you're searching for results, you can browse the database. So actually there is a search function here. It's very easy to search these studies that have been registered on the AA registry, which is a useful aspect of it. So in those 7 years, there's been this very rapid adoption of pre-registration. There's nearly 4,000 studies that have been registered. The numbers are increasing rapidly every year. Now, some of those studies that are being registered, in fact, are older studies that are kind of being put on the registry for completeness, but most are new studies. So this big increase in registration is mostly just new studies, new RCTs, new experiments that are being pre-registered. And this is a figure that sort of produces the result. And I just want to give a shout out to Sarah Stillman, who's here taking this course. So she's on the, one of the participants here, and she works with me and colleagues at SIGA, and she worked together with me and Garrett in producing this figure. So thanks to Sarah for doing that. This is data from the AEA registry. You can download the raw data from the AEA registry just on the number of registrations. And this was through about April. So by then there were about 3,400 studies registered. Now it's like 3,900. So, it just keeps going up every year. Those are the bars. And then the solid line is the registrations by quarter. So not only is the total increasing, but like the pace is increasing really rapidly. So in the first quarter of 2020, there were 400 studies registered on the AEA site. So there's some core information that's asked of folks who want to register a study: the title, the country. I've bolded a few, an abstract for the study, so to give others a sense of what the study's about. Start dates, end dates, the kind of outcome measures, the research design, et cetera, sample size, IRB approval. So, a lot of core information. The AEA site was actually designed explicitly to be relatively sparse, meaning kind of simple, to make it really easy to register. But there's also functionality that allows individuals to post additional documents, like a detailed pre-analysis plan that goes beyond these fields, on the site as well, and have that be registered and time-stamped. And in practice, there really is a wide range of detail that scholars have kind of used when registering studies. So to start a new trial, you just click on, start a trial, you enter the title, you enter the status, is it ongoing? And then basically there's just a series of these box fields to very easily kind of work you through, registration. So this is very simple. And even simpler registration is the as predicted registration that's commonly used in psychology. There's an even smaller number of fields, and it's really just meant to streamline the process. I think the thinking, both in the AEA registry and as predicted, if I can speak for them, is that there's just a lot of value and even basic information about a study. A lot of value for the scientific community in knowing that a study exists, the basic goals of the study, the basic design of a study, the basic outcomes. Just that core data adds a lot of value for the scientific community. And then sort of any information on that is obviously still valuable, but the streamlined registrations are meant to just get studies on there with core information, at least. Okay, so why might registration be useful? I'm going to go through a couple of points here, and then we can open it up for some more discussion. The first point to raise is that pre-registration creates a paper trail. So as I just alluded to, if a study's registered here on the AEA registry or EGAP or OSF as predicted, clinicaltrials.gov, then other scholars know it exists. And this can help us deal with publication bias. It can help us deal with, it can help us improve our meta-analyses, because then it's easier to search on what the relevant body of literature even is. And this is actually something that becomes very clear in the Franco et al. Paper that's cited here, which I think may be on your reading list. If not, we can share. And I saw that Alex has a kind of similar, this same sort of figure from Franco et al. This is a really brilliant figure. Franco et al. Was a paper, came out in 2014, and it was based on data that had been generated a few years earlier. There was a pretty large-scale social science funding mechanism called TESS, and this is the time-sharing experiments for the social sciences. It was NSF funded, and it funded survey experiments, basically including questions that embedded survey experiments in a large online sample in the US. And social scientists, from sociologists to economists to psychologists to political scientists, all took advantage of this mechanism to add survey experiments to this online platform. So in total, there were something like 221 experiments that were funded. They were all sort of chosen for funding. They were reasonably high quality, et cetera. And what was so unique about this data is, since the scholars here were in touch with the funders, they actually knew all the studies that had been funded. And they were able to reach out to the authors of those studies to try to find out what happened to the data that had been generated in these 221 studies. So some of those had been published, some had not been published, but what they're able to do is actually find out the status even of projects that hadn't been published. It's a little bit like a registry. They kind of knew everything that had been going on. They could see what happened. So they asked the scholars, all of them from the 221, did you get strong results, like mainly statistically significant results? Did you get mixed results, like some significant results, some results? Or did you mainly get null results? Like you ran this online experiment and sort of found that your prompt or your question or the information you provided had no impact. And you can see there's like a pretty good balance. Pretty large numbers of studies were either strong, mixed, or null. But what's really striking is the different publication trajectories of these different types of studies. So what they find here is, again, this is recent. This is like funding that was distributed in 2010, 2011, 2012, somewhere there. So less than a decade ago. If a study got strong results, it was almost always written up. It was very often, the majority of the time it was published, and very often in a top journal, sort of what was considered a leading journal. For the studies with mixed results, again, most were written up, but a little less and a little less likely to be published. What's so striking from this data is the null results. So when the author said, yeah, I really didn't see an impact of this experiment, about 2/3 of the time, the paper was never even written up. It just didn't exist. It wasn't even a working paper or a preprint, and it was much less likely to be published, let alone in a top journal. So statistically significant results were 3 to 4 times more likely to be published. And in fact, if you look at those very dark bars here, null results were something like 13 times more likely to just never be written up. So when we're talking about publication bias in the social sciences today, this is the reality we have to grapple with, which is the nature of the results dictates whether we even see the findings. And null results are very likely to disappear. So we face a situation where literatures are, we see a certain set of results in literatures, but we never see the null results. We never see the non-significant results. And that can lead to biased understandings of literatures. This is a fundamental issue. Okay, so we want to know what these studies are. When there's pre-registration, we can kind of see what's been done or what people were planning to do. Second, and related to this, the existence of a registry with, an analysis plan or however much detail helps to reduce the risk of data mining or presentation of the results that's somehow biased, like cherry picking your favorite result and ignoring lots of other results that you plan to carry out. Because when we have pre-registration, we can see what the authors intended to do and what their original hypotheses were. So if in my pre-registration, I said I'm going to test hypothesis A, hypothesis B, and hypothesis C, but then in the published paper, I only report hypothesis A, people who read the paper and can see my pre-analysis plan will say, hey, what happened to B and C? You should report those too. So it creates more accountability for scholars. Maybe there's a good reason they didn't report B and C. Maybe the data wasn't appropriate, or there was a problem in project implementation, or they're going to report B and C in another paper they're working on. Those are all fine. But I think too often in the social science community, B and C were never reported because they were null results. And the scientific community should be just as interested in a significant result as a null result, as long as it's generated by the same data and with a well-conceived project. So point 2 is important here. And there's a lot of reasons to be concerned with the sorts of reporting we get in the social sciences. So this is some data from work by Gerber and Malhotra, focusing on some of the leading sociology journals and political science journals. And what you can see on the horizontal axis here is the Z statistic, so the kind of significance level, your coefficient estimate divided by the standard error. And in most of the social sciences and other fields, there's a real focus on statistical significance with 95% confidence. So the Z statistic that corresponds to that 95% confidence level, or a p-value less than 0.05, is 1.96. And you can see in sociology journals and political science journals, there's a huge spike in values just above 1.96, like just significant at 5%, and a big kind of valley of values just below. And the same thing holds in economics and other fields. I'm not trying to single out these fields. Now, why is that? To the extent that authors have multiple degrees of freedom and they can show certain analytical specifications and not others, they can include certain covariates and not others, focus on certain outcomes and not others, they can go through a process of selection where they find the result that just makes a finding statistically significant and ignore others. And so that's a major concern. There's no natural distribution of Z statistics that would look like this with a spike at one particular value. So this is really strong evidence that there's some sort of either biased reporting or some bias in the publication process. Okay, the third potential value of pre-specification has to do with correctly sized statistical tests. So what I mean here is if we lay out in a pre-analysis plan that we're going to run these 10 analyses, well, then we kind of know that there were 10 different specifications run, and we can use some statistical techniques to deal with what's called the multiple inference problem or the multiple testing problem. If I tested 10 different things, by chance, maybe one is significant, even though it's spurious or not a very robust finding. Without a pre-analysis plan, I may have no idea how many hypotheses the author tested. They might have run hundreds of regressions or even thousands of regressions before settling on the ones they show in the paper. And when you run so much analysis, the risk of a false positive coming through really just by chance becomes much, much higher. If we really want to understand what statistical significance levels even mean in a truly scientific sense, pre-specification can be very helpful. Okay, the fourth point I've alluded to before, which is pre-registration can make open data and disclosure more effective, because now when there is something disclosed or data is posted, we know something about the author's original intention behind using that research design or generating that data. So that's another potential advantage. A fifth point that I want to raise in terms of potential advantages of pre-specification is writing a pre-analysis plan beforehand encourages scholars to more carefully think through their design and their approach before they actually launch the project. And this could improve research quality. I will say for myself, in my own personal experience, the process of writing a pre-analysis plan is extremely valuable. I've often thought of things I didn't think of before. We've caught errors. We've improved our analytical approach. So I think the possibility that doing more of this very careful thinking, making sure everything's down on paper before launching a project, the possibility that improves research quality could be a real benefit to our research fields. It could also reduce waste on projects that are sort of poorly conceived. So again, maybe funders give money to a particular scholar, but if they haven't thought through the project well beforehand, they may run some project that isn't very well conceived. If they're forced to write down a pre-analysis plan and go through in detail what they're doing, that could improve outcomes. This is going to relate a little bit to Graham Blair's session tomorrow on declare design, where there's a lot of careful thinking in his approach about what your research design really is, what it means, before running a project. So declare design is a really cool kind of extension or next step, related to pre-registration. Another way that waste can be reduced here in the research process is if studies are pre-registered, then other scholars may know that a certain type of project was carried out in advance, beforehand. And that may mean they choose not to carry it out if there's already work in that area. They may not have even heard of that study without the registry. Okay, I'm going to pause here because there could be other benefits, but I also see that there's some discussion in the chat. So maybe I'll turn to the chat briefly here. And here, we have Tamambang. Let me just go through these, and then others can also chime in, either asking a question in the chat. Is there a reason why research with no significant results usually don't see the light of publishing? Is it that authors have noticed that journals end up rejecting papers with no significant results? How can this problem be solved? So this is just a huge issue. And in my mind, as someone in this space, one of the kind of core central issues around open science in general is the disappearance of null results. It's something that occurs across fields. I think it's something that is caused by multiple factors. I think you're very right that sometimes authors have a view that, you know, journals won't publish it if it's not significant, so I won't even bother writing it up. And so even though authors would like to publish it, they have limited time and they're not going to get a publication out of it, and they don't write it up. So it could be that their expectations about what journals will do are quite important. In some recent work I've been writing up, I've tried to discuss how journal policies could change, and there is some evidence on that. So, you know, I don't know if this paper, I don't think this paper is on the reading list, but there's a really fantastic paper by Brodeur and Perez that talks about how the issue you get at Tamambang could really be important. So they look at a case where a number of journal editors sent letters to referees who are reviewing articles saying, we are open to publishing null results. We just want good research. And they actually found that that really changed the review process. So changing people's expectations about what journals want, having journal editors come out and say, we want to publish high quality studies with null results, could help change the equilibrium. Okay, so let me scroll down here a little more. This is from Xin Cheng. Some type of research is iterative in nature, e.g. propose a theory, test it in data. If theory is rejected, then modify it and test it in data again, and so forth. In that case, is it okay that the results differ from what is planned to be done? This might seem like cherry picking at first glance, but the science community might only want to consume research indicating which theory is correct, but not which theory is wrong. Probably there could be too much. So I think this is an interesting point. I think there have been a number of discussions and debates about, like, how could we kind of justify the lack of publication of null results? And for instance, Max Casey has some work on this. So in a particular type of research environment, like you said, where all we want to do is you know, find out what's right. And imagine we're in a setting where we think, you know, we're going to get, you know, 100 null results for every one true result. Then maybe the null result feels less valuable than the true result. We should just report those true results. So Max Casey has crafted a model like that. I would argue that actually most social science research does not have that flavor at all, where we can, in truth, we can learn a lot from learning what theories are right or wrong. We don't usually have 100 alternatives floating around. There may be 2 or 3. So getting data on which theories are right or wrong in that kind of space could be very valuable. But there are, you know, research settings where there may be some rationale for that. This is from Sieda Shabano. How do grad students square PAPs with developing country fieldwork, which is likely to be unpredictable, at least at some level? Do I pre-register my entire mixed methods research design or just the empirical survey? Okay, so these are 2 great points. The points about how to pre-register when things are unstable and unpredictable is critical. And I've dealt with this in my own work now for many years. What we've chosen to do in some projects when circumstances change in the field is, sure, we register an initial pre-analysis plan, but if along the way things change, there's a political problem that changes program implementation, there's a logistical problem, COVID happens, there's a problem with the survey, we register what we call an addendum to the plan. It's like a second pre-analysis plan. So along the way, we register, okay, now our thinking has changed. This situation has changed. Here's another pre-analysis plan or update with our current thinking. And if you do that along the way, the research community can see how your thinking evolved, and they can see it before you've analyzed the results. So I think that's one approach, that you can update the pre-analysis plan. In terms of the issue of the empirical survey, like maybe the quantitative work versus the mixed methods design, there really has been a lot more adoption of these methods among quantitative researchers than qualitative. that said, a lot of the same ideas and tools could be applied to qualitative research. So if you have a certain plan for your ethnographic work, for your focus groups, for your interviews that you're doing, there's no reason you couldn't pre-register those to say, I'm going to meet with these 10 community leaders and ask this set of like 8 questions in a kind of structured interview. I'm going to record the data in this way. I'm going to code answers in a certain way. There's absolutely nothing to stop you from doing that, but it is true that these methods haven't been adopted as rapidly among, say, qualitative researchers or historical researchers. And in our own data that we've collected across the social sciences, that's come through very clearly. So a lot of researchers in fields where there's a lot more ethnography, qualitative work have slower adoption. Okay, Ruben has a question here. In regards to pre-specifying research hypotheses, doesn't it make sense that people chose not to disclose their initial presumptions out of fear of being ridiculed, for lack of a better word, by their peers or superiors? This is, of course, even more important during the early stage of one's career when the pressure to create a reputation is higher. I think here this idea that if you're doing something very novel, very innovative, very controversial, you could be criticized. I think that's an issue. Now, of course, if you're working on a certain research project, eventually you're going to get the data and you're going to have to share it with the world. So eventually your colleagues will be able to criticize you. But if you are afraid of being criticized before you've even generated the data, that's where the ability to embargo the pre-analysis plan, meaning post it and timestamp it on a website, but not make it public for, say, a year or 2, that could be valuable for you. And so I think that's one way to reconcile the ability to post the value of posting a pre-analysis plan without letting colleagues see what you're doing for a little bit of time until you have your results. This is also from Sierra. Following on Shin-chan above, sometimes ethnographic engagement might change the hypotheses you care about. Would that be seen as necessarily bad if hypotheses are pre-registered? I ask because due to COVID-19, I want to drop a detailed path for my dissertation project, but I also worry that many ideas may change. Absolutely, this is a great idea. And in fact, I think in every single pre-analysis plan I've written, my field experience has helped to shape that plan. So, if you think of research as coming in stages, you could imagine some initial survey work or pilot work or field engagement before you've really designed the RCT or designed the survey. And all of that experience feeds into the design. So certainly get as much information as you can and make your pre-analysis plan as strong as possible. And there's no tension there. Now, if you already registered a plan and started a project and you do additional field work that changes your mind, as I said, put in an addendum or an addition to the plan with your new thinking. And I think many of us who have done pre-analysis plans in development economics have done something like that. Okay, so Alex just added a reference to the paper that I just talked about. And then I see a comment here from Samuel. Thanks, Alex, for doing that. What is your impression on pre-registration and pre-analysis plan compliance among senior versus junior researchers, and what could be some of the factors? Okay, so in our data for the other study I referenced before, the 3S study, where recently we've been trying to survey scholars on their attitudes and practices for open science, we surveyed both PhD students and published authors, sort of more senior folks. So we have that junior versus senior distinction. And I think what was so striking to us is that beliefs and attitudes and all these things looked so similar between junior and senior scholars. So our own prior belief, and we have a pre-analysis plan, so we said, this is what we thought, is we thought junior scholars were going to be more into open science than more senior scholars. We thought there was this generational change at work, but stated support and adoption of the practices is actually high among both. So I think that's one of the interesting things. In fact, we found somewhat more adoption among senior scholars, but that's, we think, in our data because some of the PhD students were just starting their research. So they may not have had a chance yet to generate a data set and share it, for instance. Okay, last question here from Pallavi. Hey, Pallavi. And then I'll go back to the slides. What should be done in case we obtain null results and the study was not pre-registered? What if the results are contrary to the initial expectations or not as interesting? Should one write a paper anyway or be careful of the contribution? I think definitely. If you generate null results, or any results. If you think you have good data on a good question, you should do everything you can to report those results. If they're null, if they're significant, you should try to report them. Now, you raised the issue here about the study not being pre-registered. I think one potential benefit of pre-registration is when you get a null result and you've sort of specified what you're going to do, you have a plan, it may actually be somewhat easier to publish those null results, or at least in recent years, because the referees and the editors say, wait, this was pre-specified, it's a good design. They kind of take that null result, maybe they put more weight on it. But you should still try to publish a null result, even if it was not pre-registered. It's very important to get null results into the scientific community. It's a major problem. One thing that I'll say about sort of the culture of publishing, based again on my own experience, my interaction with colleagues, students over many years, is very often researchers are kind of hoping for a certain result. And again, it's kind of hard not to on some psychological level. And this goes back to my first lecture. Someone said, well, how about this tension between feeling passionate about an area and the science? It's natural to kind of hope, if you're working on an anti-poverty program, to hope that you can make a difference with this program. But we have to be very careful as researchers not to be sort of openly cheering for, hoping for a certain result. As scientists, as researchers, we have to take the data as it is and report it as it is. And I'll see this often among my grad students that I'm working with and meeting with in office hours will say, oh, I ran this test and I didn't get this result that I really wanted. I try to tell them, look, you don't want or not want any result. As a researcher, you want the best possible data, you want to run the right test, and then the data is the data. And you're not happy or sad. Try to kind of eliminate those emotions around your t statistics. It's unhealthy to get emotional in that way, cheering for a t statistic of 2.0 instead of 1.5. The hope is if you have a sufficiently good question and good data and you've done the right analysis, you're making a contribution regardless of what that t statistic looks like. All right, so let me go back to the slide. These were really great questions, and we'll come back to some other potential benefits and costs of pre-registration. One of the costs that's often raised, or one of the concerns, is this possibility that pre-registration could be limiting. That even though there's some of the benefits I mentioned before, that it'll limit creativity, that somehow it'll slow down the scientific process. And the truth is, if you look at scientific progress across fields, many discoveries were not pre-specified. People saw some interesting pattern in their data, and they came up with some genuine scientific insight. It was exploratory what they were doing, maybe they were data mining, but they found something really meaningful there by chance or just through exploration. And the fear is, well, if we pre-specify, does that mean we're going to lose all those chance discoveries? And our view on this among those who work in this area, certainly my own view, is we don't have to lose that sort of chance discovery, because there's no reason why when you generate data, you can't explore it even beyond what you pre-specified. What's really key is knowing what is pre-specified and what isn't, and letting the reader of your work know what was pre-specified and what isn't. So that when they read your paper, they can kind of understand what a p-value means, and they understand the sort of source, the origin of the hypothesis. I think in every project I've worked on that's had a pre-analysis plan, in some way, we've gone beyond the analysis that we pre-specified. Because you see things in the field, you learn things, you see patterns in your data that are unexpected, that can then stimulate the next round of research. But it's important when we're reporting results that the reader know what we pre-specified and what we didn't. So that they can kind of understand that data better. There's too long a tradition in social sciences of doing lots of data mining, finding patterns that may or may not be spurious, but then pretending that we ran some sort of formal hypothesis test from the beginning on those tests. And that is really unscientific in some basic way. So if we ran thousands of tests and we only report 3, but we lay out our whole paper as if we had only run those 3, and the p-values on those 3 tests are really what we report, that's a little bit misleading to the reader. So I think that those are some of the things that we hope we can make more transparent in reporting. So that's one cost. The second cost that's often discussed is time cost. It just takes time to write a pre-analysis plan. It could take quite a bit of time. And the question is, do the benefits that we've talked about outweigh these costs? So we're working on something for however time. Is it worthwhile? So instead of doing some other research work, maybe we're working on our pre-analysis plan. Now, one thing I will say based on my own experience with pre-analysis plans is even though they take time up front, there can be some benefits on the back end. So if I'm putting a lot of time into really thinking through my study in advance, thinking through the regression specifications, et cetera, then when my data comes in, the whole process of analysis is much faster. So there's a timing issue that's important, and you do save some time at the back end. Related to this issue about the time cost of pre-analysis plan is how detailed should our plans be? And this is what I alluded to above. Some scholars recently have been pushing for simple plans. The idea being even the basic fields in the AA registry add a lot of value. Maybe we don't need a very intricate plan. I'm personally write quite detailed pre-analysis plans in my projects, but I still think that the core registration of a study, registering the core hypotheses, core data, et cetera, there's really a ton of value in that. Now, for me, I find it valuable to even go farther and really lay out the regressions in a lot of detail, because I feel like that helps to improve the quality of the project. But for the scientific community, there's even benefits in a rather minimalistic registration. Okay, so what do we know about this? These are, kind of hypothetical pros and cons. Let me present some data to you. There's actually two new studies that have come out, two papers by George Afosu and Dan Posner. Actually, and this research was funded by BITSS in our funding for meta research. So it's great that BITSS was able to contribute to their work. They have some of the most detailed evidence available on the pros and cons, the costs and benefits of pre-analysis plans in both economics and political science over roughly the last decade. And let me tell you what they find, because they're beginning to shed light on some of this debate I was just talking about, the costs and the benefits of pre-analysis plans. Okay, so in their first paper, they asked this question, which relates to this issue of creativity, and they ask, are pre-registered studies less exciting and less publishable? And here they focus on economics empirical papers in the NBR working paper series. There's a ton of papers in that series, so it was a good source for them to get working papers. And they were able to classify which of those papers among hundreds and hundreds of papers during that period had registered a pre-analysis plan. And to kind of compare apples to apples, they mainly focus on experimental studies, and they're kind of all studies. You guys can see my daughter in the background here. Sorry, she's grabbing something from the closet. They focused on experimental studies, and again, all studies written by NBR affiliates. So there was some sort of comparability in these studies, and some of them had pre-analysis plans, some of them didn't. And then they look at what happens in terms of publication of those studies. And what they find is the studies that had pre-analysis plans actually were about twice as likely to be published in the so-called top 5 economics journals, the kind of leading, most cited journals, and had about 60% higher citation several years later. So, this is a bit of a difficult comparison because there wasn't random selection as having a pre-analysis plan or not. Some authors may have chosen to do it, others didn't. Those authors could be different. So there could be confounders here. But their hope is, at least by controlling for the type of article, an experimental study, et cetera, they could get around some of that. And this is at least suggestive evidence that writing a pre-analysis plan for your paper doesn't kill your publication prospects. If anything, you may be getting more citations if you wrote a pre-analysis plan. So this is an interesting finding. Their second paper was based on a survey that they wrote of survey that they administered to scholars in economics and political science. And again, a couple of hundred scholars, among scholars who had written pre-analysis plans. And You know, again, there's some caveats here. The response rate, I think, was about 25%, so it's not clear how representative it is, but they still got a couple hundred responses. And they asked scholars about their experience. How long does it take? How difficult is it to write a pre-analysis plan? They found that the average time was about 2 to 4 weeks of work, which I think makes sense given my own experience. That seems like a sensible amount of time, with some range. Some are shorter, some are a bit longer. But they also asked them, was it worthwhile? Were the benefits that you got out of writing the pre-analysis plan worth the time cost of writing the plan? And about 70% of scholars said yes, the benefits outweighed the costs for them. So, you know, the majority of people writing pre-analysis plans seem to think it's worthwhile. And one thing I want to say on that last point, these are just the private benefits for those scholars. If we think about a scholarly community, a lot of the benefits of writing a pre-analysis plan are not tied to the individual scholar's project. They're social benefits. They're benefits for the whole research community in getting plans posted, studies registered, et cetera. So what's nice here, though, is the private benefits look positive for most scholars. And on top of that, we get all the community-wide benefits. Okay, I see there's a bunch in the chat. So let me go to the chat and see if there's any comments on this. So here we go. Okay, after Pallavi, we have Simon's question here. So let me start with Simon. I think exploratory analysis is really important. I have a question about how to report results of exploratory analysis to the broader public. I think there's a more limited understanding of causality among people, broadly speaking. How can we be careful that our findings aren't overstated to the public? This is such a great point. I completely agree. Exploratory analysis is important. As I said, I think in every paper I've written with the pre-analysis plan, we go beyond the plan. And that exploration, we often find interesting things in that exploration to set up the next project. So it's critical. But then you say, how can you communicate it to the public? And I think you put your finger on something important, which is very often a correlation in data that scientists and researchers know is probably not causal, is sort of put out in the public media and misinterpreted. I think this is a much harder issue to solve. I do think, you know, we need to communicate our results very clearly when we speak to journalists and try to encourage them to interpret things the right way. Sometimes they may still misinterpret them, but we should do our best to try to teach them what we know about causal inference and try to be a bit humble about okay. The next comment by Hao Yu. Could you briefly give some ideas, suggestions about exploratory type of path, especially those using primarily observational data? Thank you. I'm going to come to that in a couple slides. That's going to be a goal of mine in the next 20 minutes or so. And in tomorrow's talk, Professor Cecilia Moe is going to talk about pre-registering observational studies. To me, this is one of the really frontier topics in open science. How can we bring a lot of these tools that are now really taking off in experimental research? So like in development economics, we do field experiments. There's been this surge of pre-analysis plans and other types of open science practices. Same thing in certain branches of psychology. But most social science research is based on non-experimental data. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but Cecilia will talk about it below. Raquel thinks my daughter's cute, thank you. And then Alex is pointing towards the Afosu and Posner. Great, okay, thanks guys. So let me get back to the slides. Okay, so how widely can pre-specification be applied? And so again, this is a major open intellectual question, and again, the focus of the session tomorrow. Again, it seems immediate that laboratory experiments are a place where they can be applied. I think there is a concern that since lab experiments are so easy to run and relatively cheap, say compared to a big field experiment, that there's a concern that lab experimentalists could run many, many labs and only report a subset of those results. And that would really exacerbate issues around publication bias and reporting bias. If you're interested in evidence on this and just how severe the publication bias could be in laboratory experiments, I would point you to the Andrews and Casey 2019 American Economic Review paper, which again, hopefully Alex or Katie can point you guys towards. That is a study that indicates that there's probably within economics lab experiments, like an incredible degree of publication bias. So sort of similar to the Franco et al., at least 3 to 4 times, results are 3 or 4 times more likely to be published if significant than null. Okay, so that's an issue. That said, Muriel Netterly, I cite her here, and others have argued that, you know, the flip side is lab experiments are also cheap to replicate. So even though there may be quite a bit of publication bias, if a result is published that is significant, other labs can relatively easily try to replicate it. So that could help, but at the same time, pre-registration I think is quite important in this setting. Okay, the second question here, what about prospective observational or non-experimental studies? I think observational work that is prospective, meaning there's some plan around what the analysis will be before it's carried out, is a very promising area. Fiona Burlig's article, which I think is on your reading list, discusses these issues. Cecilia Moe will talk about them tomorrow. I'll briefly mention the Newmark article from '99 and 2001. So there really is a push across fields. Cecilia Moe's in political science, Fiona Burlig's in economics. There's a push across fields to try to bring these tools into observational work. And so what are some examples? So pre-registration would be quite straightforward to apply when new rounds of data are released, for instance. So, you know, a very famous panel data set or longitudinal data set in the US is the PSID. Before a new wave is released, one could register the tests you want to carry out. Before a new census round is released, one could pre-register the tests that are carried out. Or in any case, actually, where data is restricted. So you can't data mine. I need to like apply to get access to a certain data set. But when I'm applying for access, I could also register a pre-analysis plan around what I intend to do with the data. You know, there's an open question about what share of empirical work falls in this category, and I'm not sure, and that actually would be a valuable thing for somebody to quantify. There has been some work trying to quantify how much work published in leading social science journals is experimental versus non-experimental. I know in economics journals, it's something like 15 or 20% is experimental. The rest is observational. Among that, say, remaining 80% of observational research, how much of it was carried out in cases where there is a new round of data that's going to be released, or you needed access to data and you needed to apply for it? In those cases, you could prospectively write a pre-analysis plan. Okay, so the one issue you might run into is, you know, the AEA registry, for instance, and EGAP are very focused on experimental work. But if you wanted to register a pre-analysis plan for non-experimental work, there is a platform you could use, which is the Open Science Framework. You could really timestamp or register anything you want on Open Science Framework. So that is an alternative for people to keep in mind. And let me just go back to one last thing here. Pre-registration could also really be useful for political scientists studying elections. Pre-register your hypothesis before the election. There's no way you can data mine those results. The election hasn't happened yet. So that's another, you know, kind of instance. Okay, beyond these kinds of applied empirical studies in economics, you could imagine many different areas where you could apply these tools. In any sort of calibration exercise, whether it's macroeconomic or not, you can register the parameters you're going to use in your simulations. If you're doing more structural econometric estimation or very theory-driven work, you can register the models and parameters you're going to use. For anybody using Bayesian statistical analysis, you could register the prior distributions you're going to use before seeing the data. And sort of related to that and trying to understand prior beliefs or forecasts, there is some exciting new work by Della Vigna and Pope on exactly this issue, how to elicit forecasts and sort of incorporate them into our analysis. So this idea of kind of prospectively, you know, either registering your own priors or prospectively getting the research community's beliefs, those are things one can do and pre-register before doing any analysis. So I think we've, on some level, we've kind of scratched the surface on what we can pre-register. And over my own personal views, over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see pre-registration creeping out of experimental social science into other branches, given all the value that it gives us as scholars. Okay, and then I already mentioned this issue of the time lag and the embargo, which is possible in all these platforms to make sure researchers are not scooped or sort of others don't grab their ideas before you're able to do your own project. Okay, let me briefly mention the Newmark study, and then I'll start wrapping up and leave it for open discussion. Oh, I do see one more chat. Okay, this is the Andrews and Casey paper. Thanks, Alex, for posting that. It's perfect. Okay, so let me mention this Newmark study. This is about 20 years old. And it's a study that isn't that well known, although we write about it in the textbook. And we basically see it as a milestone, an almost forgotten, milestone in social science methodology. This was something done over 20 years ago that was a pre-analysis plan, that was pre-registered in a way, and that also basically generated what is a registered report, or something similar to a registered report, which Alex will talk about next. This was a study on a very politically contentious and intellectually contentious issue in labor economics around what the effect is of raising the minimum wage on labor market outcomes, where some people, proponents of the minimum wage say, well, we can raise the minimum wage and improve workers' well-being, but opponents say, well, if we raise the minimum wage, we're going to increase unemployment. So that was kind of the debate. There was a very active research literature on this in the 1990s in economics, including some work by Card and Krueger documenting extensive publication bias in the area. So certain types of findings were getting published, really significant findings showing negative effects of the minimum wage. But then it appeared that a lot of null findings were not getting published. So what is the Newmark study kind of all about? The solution was this idea, in an era before there was any study registry, was for an author to submit their detailed analysis plan to a journal, to the journal editor, before the relevant US government statistics had even been released. So they said, look, when the next release of government statistics come out in May, this is the analysis I'm going to run. David Newmark sent his analysis plan to the editor of the journal, David Levine, who's a colleague of mine at Berkeley in the business school, Haas. He sent it out to for review, receive referee reports, asked Newmark to revise the analysis plan before the data had been received. So, it's kind of way ahead of its time. And this was a quote by David Levine, the editor, in one of the issues of that journal, Industrial Relations, saying, the goal of this symposium was to obtain estimates of the employment effects of minimum wages that are free from bias due to specification search. This was to be accomplished by proposing that various authors involved in the debate pre-specify their design, subject it to peer review before analysis, and then carry out that analysis when the data became available. The resulting evidence should provide estimates of the employment effects that are free of author effects. Now, it turned out originally there were going to be multiple groups taking part in this, but some of them dropped out. So it was just David Newmark that participated, but he followed this approach. The underlying idea, I've spoken to David Levine about this, he's a colleague and a friend of mine, former co-author of mine, was some of the ideas really flowed from an approach that Danny Kahneman, another Nobel Prize winner, who was then at Berkeley Psychology, who's now at Princeton, had in his career in the 80s and 90s. He carried out something he called adversarial collaboration. So when he was carrying out lab experiments and there were others in the field finding different things, he would invite them to collaborate, and they would agree ex ante that the right way to distinguish between their theories was to run a certain test. And if he could get this other colleague, who maybe was on the other side of a debate, to agree on what the right test was, they would then run the experiment together. So this is actually a tremendous model of scientific collaboration. He calls adversarial collaboration. And this was a bit of the inspiration for what occurred with the Newmark study. Get different authors involved, kind of get on the same page, referee their designs, and then analyze the data that they had pre-specified. So as I mentioned, this is quite similar to what's called a registered report. I will not discuss what a registered report is because I think Alex will, but it's really an outgrowth and kind of the next step in some way of pre-analysis plans where journal articles can be conditionally accepted effectively based on the analysis plan rather than the results. So again, I'll leave that to Alex, who's gonna tell you all about that when I'm done. But it's a new format that BITSS has been trying to advance in economics and that has already been taking off in other fields. Okay, so I've left myself about 10 minutes of discussion. I see there's a little bit here in the chat box. Oh, and this is from Jeff Mickler. Newmark has a recent working paper following the same approach. Great. So thanks, Jeff, for putting that there. And, Newmark has stayed very engaged in this minimum wage debate since then. Great, so let me pause here and see if folks want to either put stuff in the chat box. I'm also very open for people to raise their hands and ask questions live too. So whatever you all prefer.
So the way to raise your hand, just in case, is under the, I think it's under the participants function, and you should be able to find your name and click raise hand. I guess if Ted's okay with it too, you could also just unmute yourself.
Sure, that'd be great.
Hi, I was wondering, could you share a little bit more about the adversarial collaboration? Like, was that intentionally done between just researchers with different perspectives, or also researchers among different fields? Because I've had a real interest in the value that groups of researchers bring. What do you bring in, like economists, anthropologists, sociologists, which I get a lot of funny looks when I say that. But I'm just kind of curious what his perspective on what that looked like was.
Yeah, so my understanding was that Michaela who was just speaking? I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for your comment. My understanding is it was done among, that collaboration was carried out with scholars in psychology, like Danny Kahneman. That said, Kahneman himself, of course, worked across psychology and economics, and is really one of the leading founders of behavioral economics, and his Nobel Prize was in economics. So I think he was already collaborating in that way. The notion of kind of moving our social science research into more kind of large scale collaborations, more group science and team science, is certainly something that's been central to the open science movement. And there's been a bunch of crowdsourced collaborations that the Center for Open Science has led, crowdsourced replications, et cetera. So I think that idea of scholars sort of coming together from different backgrounds to work on a common problem and contribute is something that has really become more, prominent or higher profile because of open science. I personally love your idea of getting scholars together across fields, and this idea of saying some economists, anthropologists, and political scientists who work on it together to agree on something or write something or see where the consensus is. I think it's done too rarely. Occasionally there are efforts to have these inter-field conversations, but I think it's rare. One of the things that I love about BITSS is in all of our annual meetings, research trainings, et cetera, it's always really interdisciplinary, and we get lots of different perspectives. I think it really enriches the space. But I'd love to hear, more about your thoughts, either now or offline, about these types of interdisciplinary collaborations. I think that we could all learn a lot more from each other.
Thanks, that really helps.
And I don't know if Katie or Alex, again, sorry to keep pointing you, but if you guys could put in the chat box maybe one of the Center for Open Science, like the reproducibility challenges and that kind of stuff. I think that could give Michaela, if she isn't aware of it already, give her some sense of that. I think there maybe, did someone in the chat add something? Let me just see. Oh, great. So this is from Fernando. Great. Okay. Any other thoughts, comments, reactions, questions?
I guess I have a comment question.
Yeah.
So, with the idea of trying to, move pre-analysis plans into a larger field, most of economics isn't experimental. How much do you think the limitation at the AEA registry to just experimental work signals to researchers that, pre-analysis plans are really just an experimental thing, and it doesn't, there's no value to applying these things to observational studies?
I think it does, and I'm not a fan of it. And I've commented to the folks running the registry about exactly that point, that I think it shouldn't just be called the RCT registry. My understanding, based on discussion with folks who are involved within the AEA executive committee in the initial conversation, was that it was seen as a little bit of a, like the narrow focus on RCTs was a little bit of a compromise to get the thing going and launched at the time. But I personally think pre-registration can be applied more broadly. And I do hope eventually the AEA policy will change on that. Because again, you could pre-register a pre-analysis plan for how you're going to use census data or something, just as well as experimental data. The good thing is there are these other tools like the OSF, where someone can use it. And you know, even in like I mentioned the Ofosu-Posner work, trying to really like survey what pre-analysis plans are out there and what people think. And they were even finding during that period of 2011 to 2018, you know, a bunch of observational pre-analysis plans were already there. And I think the numbers have increased since then. I'm just anecdotally, I'm hearing about more of them. So, I mean, I totally see your view that the way it's framed has kind of, you know, dampened that a little bit in our field, but hopefully not forever.
Looks like you've got a question in the chat box too.
Oh, great.
Jed.
Oh, okay, good. I missed that. Thanks. Okay, this is from Julian. Regarding pre-analysis plans stifling serendipitous findings, isn't there still a tension between journalists penalizing deviations from the plan and novel findings being discovered? If making changes to pre-analysis plans or presenting results that are not in them, couldn't filing plans become more of a formality in the long run? So I think that's a good question. And it's been sort of this concern that, like, lurking in the background of the discussion on pre-analysis plans is this fear that somehow deviations will be penalized. And, you know, I'm writing a piece right now for Journal of Economic Perspectives, kind of taking on some of this, at least based on my own experience. I think every single paper I've ever written, read, seen, reviewed with a pre-analysis plan goes beyond the plan. I don't think there's like literally a paper in economics that doesn't have some additional analysis. And certainly in my own refereeing, editor work, et cetera, I've never seen anybody say, punish this person for going beyond the plan. Like, in theory, it could happen, but it certainly has not evolved that way in our field. The only thing people do want is delineation of what was pre-specified and what wasn't. So my own feeling is in these early days around plans, a good norm has developed where people are not being punished for doing exploratory work, as long as they're clear about it. So I'd hope, Julian, that doesn't happen. If we ever reach that equilibrium, like a pretty like fundamentalist kind of equilibrium where it's like, no, you can only present research findings that are pre-specified, nothing else has value, I would be very sad because we would lose a lot of value in our research. And I don't think that's where our field is going. And I think all of us who see the benefits in pre-registration have to fight equally hard to make sure we don't get to that kind of extremist position of like, you know, something that's not pre-specified is useless, because I don't think that's true. We learn so much from observational work. We always have, we always will. Or sorry, non-pre-specified work, whether observational or experimental. Okay. Francisca asks a question. When you pre-register your research project, for example, a field experiment, there are many things that could change the scenario, the social context, policies that affect your work in the middle of your experiment. Do you have to report these problems? Do you have to update your pre-analysis plan? Again, I think this is a very good question. To the extent that there's a change in the field that forces you to change design or data in the middle of the project, I think you should add to the pre-analysis plan and register another document, like an update, saying, look, this thing happened, this is how it's going to change our analysis. That's my view. Now, for certain things, maybe there was a problem in the field that did not change your analysis substantively. You know, you're going to stick with the same plan, but it does affect interpretation of the results. It could be that that's something you write up in the paper. You know, we did this, you know, COVID happened. So a lot of people, myself included, were in the middle of projects and surveys. And I think every development economist on this call or anybody doing international field work was affected by this. And we had to change and we had to adapt what we were doing. And that led to some additional updates to the pre-analysis plan. And it's certainly going to lead to some additional text in the subsequent papers about how to interpret results in the COVID era. So I think you're right, but I think we want to be flexible and allow people to update plans. Jonathan has a comment. Krueger and ante have an honest method for determining heterogeneous treatment effects. I think they mentioned that someone used this for experiments to understand heterogeneous treatment effects even without pre-registration. Completely, and thanks, Jonathan, for raising that. The whole machine learning thrust has been very important in economics. It's important across the social sciences. And there are ways to sort of combine those with experimental approaches. So I would just point people towards some work from a couple years ago by Viktor Chernozhukov, Esther Duflo, and co-authors that attempts to bring machine learning type tools into use with experimental data. This is related to some of Wager and Athey and Imbens. So these are not like approaches that are in tension. We can very much bring machine learning tools into our experimental approaches. I also think we can use ideas related to pre-registration with machine learning. There still are degrees of freedom into whether I'm going to use lasso or ridge or random forest or other things, and how I'm going to tune the models. And so to the extent that we can pre-specify some of those, we can get around some of the kind of researcher degrees of freedom. I think I'm out of time, and I don't want to take up Alex's time. Let me just quickly look at these last few points, and then I'll wrap up. Thanks, Samuel, for the nice words. And then I see Maria, can we share details or links to a PAP about how you add them in practice? So Maria, since you're at Berkeley, how about I'll send you an email and let's be in touch, and I can point you to some projects of mine for sure. But like even some of our, lab work on ethnic politics in Kenya, we did this. Our rural electrification project, we did this. And then Stephen asked about psychology, the utility of registration with detractors. Okay. These are really good comments. Maybe if we can collect these, you guys can send them to me and I can respond, and we can also chat in the office hours. And then Winnie says, what are the research findings about whether PAPs make research more transparent and credible? This is a critical question. I think Ofosu and Posner are the first step in this. There is some evidence from medical research, though, suggesting benefits of having registration, which I can point you to. And then Jonathan makes a point about machine learning and PAPs, and then saying you can definitely do machine learning and a PAP. And I totally agree that machine learning gives you flexibility, and you can specify the algorithm that then lets you look at the data flexibly. And I think that's one of the cool things about this combination. So